Why was architecture for hundreds of years, centuries? Why will you connect to it so easily? And I couldn't understand that. And then you start understanding what happened in the 20th century. You have to understand war. War gave us our world. And in the 20th century, the first 50 years of the 20th century, it was devastating. New industries got developed because of the war. And then so a need to recreate, to start from fresh and start a new way of thinking. And that's also led to modern architecture. And that's what happened. And then you learn, too, that some of the science is very new. Words like post-traumatic stress disorder, post-PTSD, wasn't even a word doctors knew until 1980. And you realize modern architecture becomes blank and kind of soulless. Why? So their modern architecture is a direct expression of the trauma of the World War I trench. In America, at least, there's no mandatory biology or psychology course to get a master's or a bachelor's or a license to practice architecture. So this happens all over in academics where things get siloized,
But then the funding wasn't like something that was going to be provided, like, okay, we're not going to fund this type of research. Whereas, the first thing I thought of was, treating PTSD through the lens of architecture. And I was saying that it was very important, especially in our area here in the East. And now you're saying the World War I and II, which is also like touched the West. And you were saying also something very important, that the Americans were connecting with the French traditional or historical or architecture of heritage. Whereas we can see that the US is quite new. So they were not connecting with an architecture that they grew up with. But then why this connection?
Right. No, it's very interesting. A rush to be modern, not realizing that it doesn't really fit what we need to see. So, the professors of architecture school don't know that Walter Gropius is really only showing. They don't realize that the design is a connection between mind and brain and external reality. It's together. And when you have PTSD, you do see the world differently and you do design differently. Just be creative. That's not true. That's not how it works.
So what you're touching on is exactly two subjects that are the first subjects I worked on, the PTSD and obesity. I published research about it, and I took as a case study Beirut. It's exactly what happened. There was a war, and the decision makers were like, turn on the page of the past. We want to build something new. People felt disconnected. And until now,
That's
when
also
they remember the past, they are attached to that past and they don't know why. It's because this is where they were finding themselves. This is where they found some kind of security. And now they detach suddenly, like, where did this period go? Through the lens of developmental psychology, when you have to go through childhood and then adolescence and then adulthood, and then you cut adolescence and suddenly you find yourself an adult. Like, where did this phase go of transition? And so you cannot detach people from, first of all, the biological part of them, which is like they're meant to walk, and then the parts of their brain that are working in their primitive mode still. So even if they tell you, I feel fine, this is where comes the magic of using the eye tracking and the facial expression tools to understand what's really happening in their bodies and what their bodies are trying to say, not what their words or learned collectively words to say to adapt. So there's this kind of trauma that gets passed, through DNA, and it's confirmed scientifically. Yep. And then you have this kind of trauma that, like, when you hit yourself. So it's not only the emotional shock of a situation, it's also when you hit yourself, when you fall. And this is where your fascia is disturbed. And this is what I'm working on, like how to heal or like alleviate.
And what you said about trauma is true. There are many different kinds of trauma.
Like we don't need to think of trauma as just like a huge earthquake or a war. You can have it on the scale of your neighborhood. If things are like the buildings are chaotic, the street is not clean, the configuration is not like according to what your eyes are meant to see and your senses are meant to feel, and it's disturbing the climate, the weather. So this also is a shock to the body. think we were taught most just to get this, wow, what an effect, what a shape. It's like just to have this kind of satisfaction or gratification for a project more than maybe a storytelling.
You know why they're doing that? Because there's a figural primitive, there's a template for the face upright by the third trimester in utero. They project pictures of faces through the uterine wall of pregnant women in their third trimester, and the fetuses respond to the upright, not the upside down face. The most important thing for us to see to survive as a social species is the face. The number one thing people click on is a book cover with a face. The number two is with a pet.
It's about the face, but it's also about the movement.
And we want to really change, just like what you're trying to do, change the language of how people understand design and introduce the science that the business world and the car companies are already using into a field that's ignored it for a century. So one reason our urban spaces are failing and I think are not sustainable is they're not studying human perception the way we need to. What's fascinating is we really see the world like the animal we are.
The nonverbal
verbal language, that's it.
Emotional. We're more of emotional, and then we put the thought on it just to justify our emotion.
So we need to get that science out there. It's a paradigm shift.